This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, good morning everyone. Bruchim Habayim. We're going to try to delve into two separate pockets on Daf Lamed Hey, both on Lamed Hey Amud Beis. I guess we'll make it two different segments. The first segment is an amazing question of the Noda B'Yehuda. The Mishnah says that if you marry the Yevama, you are machnis the Yevama, and she turns out to be pregnant and she has a viable child, so you can't stay with her and you have to bring a carbon. Why do you have to bring a carbon? Because you're a shoygeg. You violated an Isser Kares b'shoygeg. Yeah? You violated an Isser Kares b'shoygeg. Fine, simple enough. Now, was it the person's fault? Maybe to a certain extent, because he really should have waited 3 months to determine that she's not pregnant. So, on the one hand, he's not intentionally trying to sin. He didn't realize she was pregnant, but there was that possibility. So he's a shoygeg. Tosfos, if you have a Gemara in front of you, on Lamed Hey Amud Beis, the second Tosfos has an amazing chiddush. Tosfos' chiddush is b'choyleitz toich gimel chadashim ayri. We're talking about where you did chalitza within the first 3 months. Dumya de seifa. Just like in the seifa. The whole Mishnah is that says if you give chalitza to Yevama and she turns out to be muberes, so you're mutter and her relatives, and she's mutter and his relatives. If the Vlad's ben Kayama, it's talking about in the first 3 months. Why? How do we know we're talking about in the first 3 months? Tosfos says, Dumya de seifa. The hakoines yevimtai, if you marry your Yevama, the ayri toich gimel. The seifa of talking about marrying the Yevama is talking about within 3 months. Tila achar gimel, because if you're going to say it's talking about after 3 months, and the woman's pregnant, you're not chayiv a carbon, because we know there's a rule that after 3 months it's recognizable that she's pregnant. So if the guy waits 3 months and he sees she's not pregnant and really she was, you're not chayiv a carbon, that's an oines. That's not a shoygeg, that's an oines. Amai chayiv carbon. Kivan deroiv nashim ubarin nikar l'shlish. Most women, their pregnancy is recognizable after a third. Vizu, and if this woman, havloi hukar ubara, since her ubar was not recognized, mai havlei lemevad. What should he have done? She said, what do you mean, what should he have done? He should have waited more than 3 months. Because most women are recognizable after 3 months. But there are women who are not. The answer is no, he's allowed to follow a roiv. So we know that most pregnancies are recognizable after 3 months. By the way, we're holding now in between Rosh Chodesh Shvat and Tu B'Shvat. And one of the ideas of the Machlokas Beisham Beis Hillel, is it Rosh Chodesh Shvat or is it Tu B'Shvat, is based on this yisoid, that things become recognized after a third. And if the ikar is tshuva miyira on Rosh Hashanah, then a third later, 4 months later, Cheshvan, Kislev, Teves. In other words, Tishrei, Cheshvan, Kislev, Teves is 4 months, a third. So Beis Shammai says Rosh Chodesh Shvat, as opposed to Beis Hillel, he says the ikar is Sukkos, tshuva me'ava. So it's recognizable after a third, which is Tu B'Shvat. But Tosfos is saying like this, that when the Mishnah says if you live with the Yevama and she turns out to be pregnant, you have to bring a carbon, that's only within 3 months, because within 3 months there's no roiv. But after 3 months, where there's a roiv, and it turned out that she was pregnant, you would not have to bring a carbon, because mai hava leila mevad. What should the guy have done? Tosfos holds that you are an oines, okay? Tosfos holds you're an oines. Says Tosfos, what is this analogous to? Uchahagavna amrinam b'shvuas prat la'oines gabe shaloi b'shas vesta. We say a similar thing. Let's say somebody lives with their wife, and in the middle of relations, she's persanida. Do you have to bring a carbon? Are you a shoygeg? You're not a shoygeg, you're an oines. You had no reason to expect that she would be persanida. Meaning, If somebody lives with their wife, b'shas vesta, at the time she's expecting and she's personida, you have to bring a carbon because that's a shoygeg. You were negligent to an extent because you should have realized that there's a possibility that she might be personida. But if somebody lives with their wife shaloi b'shas vesta, the Gemara in Shavua says you don't bring a carbon because you're an oines. Says Tosfos, the same way if you live with your wife shaloi b'shas vest and she's personida, you're an oines. Likewise, if you live with a Yevama after 3 months and she turns out to be pregnant, you don't have to bring a carbon because you're an oines. You could follow the Rav. Comes
during 3 months. Why is it that a shayik that should be then the more closer to amazing? Because you should have at least waited 3 months. Why did you do Yevamos twice?
Because she doesn't look pregnant. Most women are not pregnant. It's not. She is presumed not to be pregnant.
It's at best a suffix.
I don't think. I wouldn't say that. Most women are besuffic pregnant. There's a possibility. There's a chance, but I don't know if you could call it a suffix, especially if she doesn't look that way. It's possible. She might be pregnant, but So with
she's not bleeding, isn't that another sign that you could notice? That what if she's a very skinny girl for 6 months? You're not going to tell she's pregnant, but she stopped bleeding. Isn't that the rub also?
I mean the fact that she doesn't have a period.
Right.
I don't know. Within 3 months. Again, he's living with her within 3 months, and she doesn't have a period. So it should be more karov lamezid. She was bleeding. Sometimes women are pregnant; they bleed. It happens. What?
It's not the majority of women.
Right.
No?
Some women bleed when they're pregnant. Some women don't bleed when they're not pregnant. So This is Tosfos' principle. After 3 months, you would not be chayv a carbon because most women are not pregnant after 3 months. Otherwise, they would be recognizable. Just like if you live with a woman, shaloi b'shas vesta. So the Noda has the following amazing kasha. Here, look where this underline is over here. It says Noda. This is a Noda Yoredea Tinyana Siman Tzadivav. Says v'zed doima mamish l'isha sheidu shnei edim shel misa al misas bala v'niseis v'achar kach ba'bayla shechayaves b'karbon. There's a mesechta called Yevamos, and on Daf Pei Zayin in Yevamos, the Mishnah says as follows: if you live with a woman, you have a woman, edim come, say your husband died, and she marries, and her husband walks in the door, she's chayiv to bring a carbon. You hear this? She has to bring a carbon. The halacha is, again, Edim came, the Edim said her husband died, and she went and she married, based on the testimony of Edim. The halacha is, she is chayiv in a carbon. So the Noda quotes a question of a very sharp gadol. The name of this gadol is... This is found in the beginning of the tshuva. The name of this gadol is the Chidushe Haraza, Reb Wolf Alaskar. Alaskar. Reb Wolf Alaskar. That's the name of this gadol. And the question is, why, if a woman marries based on the testimony of Eidim, she's not allowed to get married? If she gets married, she has to bring a carbon. Why isn't she an Oinus? She followed witnesses, she followed Eidim. The same way, if a man follows the Rov and he lives with this woman and she turns out to be pregnant, he doesn't have to bring a carbon because he's an Oinus, because he followed the Rov, and most women are not pregnant. And the same way, if a person lives with a woman, Shloi B'Shas Vesta, and she turns out to be a Nida, you don't have to bring a carbon. So too, if a woman gets married based on Eidim, she should be able to, she should be pater from a carbon, because she's an Oinus, she followed Eidim. Right? You hear the Kasha? That's the Kasha Noda Yehuda. Why is following a Rov, why is following a Chazaka, that a woman won't see Shaloi B'Shas Vesta, why would that be more of a basis to get remarried than Eidim? L'chayra, Eidim is stronger than a Rov. Eidim is stronger than Chazaka. Not L'chayra, it is. In other words, Eidim is much stronger than a Rov. Eidim is much stronger than Chazaka. So then why, if you get married based on Eidim, do you bring a carbon? If you get married based on a Rov or based on Chazaka, you don't bring a carbon. Good kasha? Says Noda Yehuda, an amazing chiddush. V'hanira lanias daiti l'chalek. It would seem, in my humble opinion, that you could make the following differentiation. Deshani niseis al pi edim. It's different if a woman gets married based on edim. Af shemutaras li nasei al piem. Even though she's allowed to get married, it's a mistake. It's extenuating circumstances. That's an error. Because the Eidim were false Eidim. They were false witnesses. The Eidim lied. You like this size over here. The Eidim hitu oisai b'sheker, and the Eidim misled them falsely. L'chein mechshav adavar tas. Therefore, it's a mistake, v'shkaga, and it's an error, v'lo yoinus. In other words, she was allowed to follow the Eidim, but at the end of the day, the Eidim were false Eidim. They were erroneous Eidim. They were Eidim that had no right to testify. Now, she didn't know that, but she's not relying on a valid source of information. Now, she was allowed to rely on it, but it turns out that it was not reliable. It's a mistake. However, if you live with the woman Shalai B'Shas Vesta, that you're allowed to have tashmish, there's no error. There's a chazaka. She's not going to see. Even though she sees, it doesn't make the chazaka wrong. There's a real chazaka. There's a true chazaka that she's not going to see. It happens to be sometimes she does, and this is one of those times. So the chazaka is a chazaka amiti. So if you rely on a evidence which is a true evidence, so then if the evidence turned out not to be accurate in this case, it's a oinus. Most women, after 3 months, they're not pregnant. Otherwise, she would be recognizable. Now, this woman did not follow that Rov. This woman was pregnant, even though you can't see. But the Rov is a Rov amiti. It's a true Rov. We're not saying the Rov is not true. It's a true Rov, and you're allowed to rely on it. It's just this case was from the miyot. So when you rely on a Rov amiti or you rely on a chazak amiti, that is considered an oinus. However, Eidim, even though they're more reliable than a Rov or a chazaka, but it turned out that these were false Eidim. And so then we're not going to call it an oinus, we're going to call it a mistake. Ve'en kantos, by chazaka, rakal pidin Torah, he muteres l'shamesh, she's allowed to be meshamesh afilu persanida be'emtza habiyah, even if she became a nida in the middle of the biyah anosu. Akanisa, you're an oinus on the beginning of the biyah. Ve'en kan shumtos, there's no mistake here. It was an emestika chazaka. V'chein isha shenesiyad ma'achar gimel chadashim. A woman that did Yibam after 3 months, afilu nimtzeis achak muberes, even if she turns out to be embarrassed, hare al pidin or yamatul yama. You're allowed to do Yibam to her. Sharoiv nashim ubara nikolish l'shamim. Most women, their pregnancy is recognizable after a third. V'harei Torah amra. The Torah says achrei rabim lahatois. You're allowed to follow the roiv. Umen Torah azlinan basaruba. Min Torah you follow the roiv. Nimsa sha'oines shalayibam azeh loy hayal pitos. This was not an extenuating circumstance. That was not an error. The difference between Eidim and Chazaka and Roiv is Eidim and Chazaka and Roiv are true. Just this case was the exception to the rule. But by the Eidim, it wasn't true. They were lying. So it's a shoygeg, it's a toss, it's not oinus. It says, an individual that follows the psak of Bezdin has to bring a carbon, even though he's an anus. Meaning you'll say, what do you mean he's an anus? The Torah says I'm allowed to listen to Bezdin. Sharei ksiv al pi atar sharucha mikol makam oinus al pi ba. This anus came through a mistake. Sha Bezdin to b'hira. Therefore, it's considered a shoygeg. In other words, it says in Noda Yehuda, oines doesn't automatically pater you from a carbon. You bring a carbon anytime you sin when there is an error. So when Eidim testify falsely, there's an error. When Bezdin makes a mistake, there is an error. When you're following Chazak or you're following a Roiv, there was no error. The Roiv is true. The Chazak is true. This case was just the exception. Ela Shem Asu Kol Yisrael Al PM. If all of Klal Yisrael follows them, Ha'oisim P'turim and HaKarbon, those who act are pater from the carbon. Loi mitam oinus, not out of an oinus, Elakivin Shabezin Chayavin carbon. Now here's the thing. If an individual follows Bezdin, he has to bring a carbon because there's a mistake. It's just if all Klal Yisrael follows the Bezdin, those who follow are pater from the carbon, they're not pater because it's an oinus, but rather since the Bezdin is chayiv a carbon, therefore those who follow are pater. But when an individual follows the Bezdin, where the Bezdin doesn't bring a carbon, the individual brings a carbon. So this is an amazing chiddush in Noda Yehuda. Number one, we have the great chiddush of Tosfos, that the din that you bring a carbon for being miyabim, a pregnant woman, is only within 3 months. After 3 months, you're an oinus because of roiv. Noda Yehuda asks that if you follow eidos, you don't bring a carbon. Excuse me, you do bring a carbon. Noda Yehuda says following eidos is a toss. You're allowed to do it, and you're still an oinus, but it's a shoygeg because there's an error. If you follow Chazak or Roiv, there's no error. It's just the Chazak or Roiv was found to have its exception. Comes Reb Shmuel Rozovsky. Reb Shmuel Rozovsky, Rashiva Panovich, in Ois Shin Nun Vav. I believe I was born the day after Reb Shmuel passed away. I think he was Nifter Chafei Tammuz, Tavshin Lametes. He says, Chai Gavna Amrina B'Shvuas Pra La'oines Gabishlo B'Shas Vesta. Tosfos brings an analogy that this, if you live with a woman if you marry a Yevama and she turns out to be pregnant after 3 months, you're an oinus like living with your wife Shalai B'Shas Vesta. So Rav Shmuel asks, Rayosam Tzarch Biur, because there you're being mishamish with the Tahira, and she was Persanida Shalai B'Shas Vest during Bia. That's an oinus Gomor. What should the guy have done? But here he could have waited. What's the analogy of Tosfos? A guy lives with his wife innocently, Shalai B'Shas Vest. How in the world is he supposed to figure she's going to be Persanida in the middle of the Tashmish? But in this case, it's not an oinus. He could have waited more than 3 months. Well, Tosfos holds that since roiv nashim ubarim nikar, after a third, you're an oinus, because you relied on the roiv. However, there's not such a raya from the Gemara in Shavuos. Now the Noda Yehuda asks, based on the Mishnah later on, that if Eidim come that her husband died and she got married, and then the husband came, you're chayiv in a carbon. Rashi says, why? You should have waited. So the Noda would ask, even though it was mutter to rely on the eidos, it's not an oinus, because she could have waited. So too regarding Roiv, why don't we say she could have waited? So the Noda says that in our case, even when it becomes clear that this woman was pregnant and is not from the Roiv was not destroyed. But by the Eidim, after her husband comes, we see the Eidim were shakranim. Meaning, Roiv says most women are not pregnant. So when this woman turns out to be pregnant, it's not disproving the Roiv. But when Eidim say the husband is dead and he walks in the door, it's disproving the Eidim. Says Rav Shmuel, I don't understand the Noda B'Yehuda's Chiluk. Ulam be'emes tzarich biur hasfar b'zeh. It requires explanation. What is the svara? What difference does it make if it became clear afterwards that it was a ta'os or not? In either case, minadin, you can rely on the edus, just like you can rely on the roiv. And if when relying on a roiv, you're an oinus, so why don't we say when you rely on the edim, you're an oinus? You're right, it turns out the edim were not good edim. But question, are you allowed to rely on the edim? Yeah. So why aren't you an oinus? So the Reb Shmuel tries to explain as follows: V'ulai efshar liyashev deshani roiv dahavabir. There's a difference between roiv and edim. Roiv proves this is what was. Edim prove nothing. It's just exeris hakasav, you listen to them. The fact that Edim testifies someone died doesn't prove they died. It's just the Torah says you're allowed to believe them. It's not a proof. It's a biblical gzeres hakasav. V'ulai efshar liyashev deshani roiv dahavabir. Maybe roiv is different because it's a clarification. I'm going to skip 3 lines because he gets into the sugya of takva kayin umisham hachi kishasamach haroiv. If you rely on the roiv and imtachgach she'ena mei haroiv chashav einus, because logically you could rely on the roiv. Mashe'en came be'edim. There's no proof by edim, but the Torah is mechadesh that based on 2 edim, that's the way we do. That's the way we act. So if they're found to be shakranim, it's not an einus. Because logically, you should have no right to rely on 2 edim. You don't know if your husband's alive or dead. So 2 guys came and say he's dead. Okay, good for them. How does that prove that he's dead? Maybe they're lying. People lie all the time. Many people lie. Just because 2 people say something, saying, every day the New York Times prints about 500 articles. Most of them, they're not even true. And even though you have many, many people who review them, so just because 2 people, 10 people could say something, doesn't mean it's true. Most of the news never happened. It's a figment of somebody's imagination. So, doesn't mean it's true. But the Torah said when 2 Yidden come into a court and testify, even though logically there's no reason to say that's evidence, it's exeris hakasav. But you're taking your chances, Rav Shmuel says. If they turn out to be liars, then you're not an oinus. You have to bring a carbon. Now you're not amazed. But says Rav Shmuel, Miu akati yesh li Iyun, there's still what to look into. Lefizet tzarich loymar, you have to say she'ein roiv, she'edim oimrim emes. Rav Shmuel says, wait a second. If roiv is a birur, then forget about the fact that the Torah says that you're allowed to follow Eidim. Don't most Eidim tell the truth? And if they do, then you should be an oinus because you follow the roiv that most Eidim tell the truth. So you have to say that there's no such roiv that most Eidim tell the truth. Because otherwise, remove from here that Eidos, in other words, forget the fact that Eidos is exeris hakasav. Forget the exeris hakasav. Most Eidim tell the truth. I mean, I would humbly say that roiv is not a statistical thing. So even though most Eidim tell the truth, does that necessarily mean you can make a roiv out of it? Anyway, this is a very fundamental question of the Noda B'Yehuda. Why is following Chazaka and Roiv an oines, and following Eidim not an oines? Okay, Rabbi Say, we move on to the second segment. If you would...
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.